So good evening and welcome to actually our first monthly lecture of this new academic year. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor István Rév, who was my colleague at the CEU when I was there many years ago, and has continued to be a faithful friend because he was here just last week, spent his weekend with us at the Vienna Humanities Festival giving an absolutely brilliant talk. If you missed it, you can hear it and see it on our webpage very soon. We're going to put up the events from the festival there. István Rév is Professor of History and Political Science at the CEU. But he's also the founder as well as the director of the Open Society Archives. It's probably the largest of the Cold War archives in the world today, probably one of the largest collections of documents on or concerning human rights. But we could not have a better speaker on the question of episodes in the history of the maker of fact, because this is a very particular archive, which is István's book, Retroactive Justice, Prehistory of Communism, which was published in 2005, also chronicles. In a sense, it carries all the ghosts of history that formed seminally the perceptions on both sides in Europe. It is a novel access to the entire question of communism and its collapse, I think, because what the archive contains are many of the, if I may say so, the lies, deceptions, self-deceptions of the past century, representations of violence, terror, and from both really high levels of state official documents to very low level of state officials, letters, documents, everyday kinds of archival material as well. And if I remember the opening sentence, István, of your book, right, the first word is trust not in words. And it's remained in my memory ever since I read the book, because the next 300 pages, if you like, is words, words, and words that challenge all kinds of conventions in history writing. It's a tour de force, both methodologically and, of course, thematically, about questions of justice. Before that, the books which are, for which István is sorry. I have two Ivans in the house, and so I'm so much more used to the first name. So István's books are in Hungarian, Economic and Social History of Hungary in the Period of Socialism, The Great Hysteria, and the Cactus Island. The talk today goes to the heart of István's new project about the question of facts, facticity, and the makers of those facts, about whom we will hear from you presently. So welcome to the Institute. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, and you have the word.
Thank you very much, Rolini. Good evening. So I'm a historian, and I will present tonight a sort of a historical talk here, which is in part a prehistory of something which is important in the world today. But I would also like to suggest a perspective from which we can look at some of the most unsettling phenomena around us, the undermining of the credibility of facts in the world. I would like to apologize. I have a very long chapter. I'm writing a book now, and this is a long chapter, and this is the first time I'm presenting this in public. And I will try to demonstrate what I'm going to say here, and this is why I will use a case study, a very detailed case study, so please bear with me and forgive me for that. The Reichs case, the most famous of the Stalinist show trials in Hungary, led to the trial and sentencing of 105 people in Hungary and 526 in other, mostly Central and East European countries. Laszlo Reichs, Minister of Foreign Affairs, former Minister of Interior, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, one of the leaders of the interwar illegal communist movement, was indicted in the summer of 1949 by having been an informer of the interwar fascist secret services, given up his comrades, having been an agent provocateur in Spain, a Trotskyite, a counter-revolutionary who conspired to overthrow the regime and the party, spying in the service of the US intelligence, and having sold himself to Tito's Yugoslavia, on whose behalf he had planned to assassinate the leaders of the Hungarian party. The case started with a scrap of paper that arrived from Paris from one of the agents of the Hungarian military counterintelligence. The sender of the note in the spring of 1948 reported that a friend of his, member of the Swiss Workers' Party, had mentioned him once that a certain Noel Field, the American director of the Unitarian Service Committee during the Second World War in Switzerland, had connections with members of the Hungarian National Independence Front in Switzerland at the end of the war. Field arranged through Alan Dulles, who at that time was a senior officer of the US Embassy in Bern, in fact the station chief of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services in Europe during the war. So through Alan Dulles, he arranged to these Hungarian communists to fly from Marseille to Belgrade on board of an American Red Cross plane and then return to liberated Hungary. The note sent from Paris eventually led to the trial and sentencing of hundreds of people, most of them veteran communists from inside and outside Hungary. As a consequence of that piece of paper, Noel Field was kidnapped in May 1949 in Prague, brought secretly to Budapest, where he was kept in prison without a trial until October 1954. Herta Field, his wife, who was desperate to find his disappeared husband, was kidnapped in August 1949 in Bratislava and held in a Hungarian prison, incidentally for a long time and without having neither of them been aware of it, in adjacent prison cells. His brother, the famous architect Herman Field, in search of both his brother and sister-in-law, was arrested in Warsaw and finally released from prison without a trial in 1954. And to the capture of Erika Glaser Wallach, the foster child of the Fields, who was arrested while searching for her foster parents in East Berlin, who was subsequently transported to Moscow, sentenced to death, which was then commuted to 15-year terms in a labor camp, and who was released from Vorkuta only in 1955. Following the break between Stalin's Soviet Union and Tito's Yugoslavia, and the expulsion of Yugoslavia from the Comintern, Tibor Szőnyi, the former leader of the Hungarian National Independence Front in Switzerland, was arrested in May 1949 in Budapest. At the beginning of his interrogation, Szőnyi was questioned about his activities in Switzerland, his connection to Noel Field, and then to Alan Dulles. But after he was physically tortured, the questions turned to his return to Hungary through Yugoslavia by the help of Alan Dulles, brother of John Foster Dulles, an early proponent of the policy of rollback against communism. A few days later, the accusations took on a new shape. Szőnyi became a Yugoslav agent and spy, whose higher connection was the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs, the number 2 leader of the Hungarian party. On May 30th, 1949, László Rajk was arrested. The 17 members of the Hungarian National Independence Front were arrested, together with anyone else who, to his or her bad fortune, either had any usable connection to the emerging story of László Rajk's dark past, or could enrich the ever more complicated plot of the indictment. The Rajk trial and its side trials belong to the category of conceptual trials. The conceptual trial is a performance acted out in court where the concept takes precedent over legal, evidentiary, or material concerns. It is the logic of the unfolding plot itself that organizes the evidence. The facts, the raw material, and the facts and the raw material. In the summer of 1947, on the invitation of the Yugoslav government, Rajk, still a minister of the Interior, spent his summer vacation in one of the government's resorts on the Adriatic Sea. As part of the usual protocol, Alexander Ron Kovic, the Yugoslav Minister of Interior and head of the Yugoslav military intelligence, paid a courtesy visit to Rajk and his wife at the seaside. A few months later, Josip Broz Tito officially visited Hungary, accompanied, among other members of this government, Ron Kovic. After the conclusion of the official part of the visit, the Hungarian government invited the Yugoslav leaders to a hunting party near to the Hungarian-Yugoslav border. Rajk was assigned to accompany the delegation. When the Yugoslav boarded their train at the border station, Rajk, seeing the Yugoslav leaders off, got on the train and had a 10-minute conversation with his counterpart, the Yugoslav Minister of Interior, in his compartment. The farewell of the Yugoslav delegation, together with the images of Rajk climbing slowly up the stairs of the train, were shown in movie theaters as part of the official newsreel released about the friendly visit. The indictment recalls Rajk meeting with Ron Kovic at the train station at the Hungarian border, when, in the solitude of the private compartment, Ron Kovic gave detailed orders to Rajk about the way the conspirators should infiltrate into the highest echelons of the Hungarian party and government to undermine the stability of the regime. Ron Kovic, as Rajk confessed at the trial, gave me the task of overthrowing, and I quote him, gave me the task of overthrowing the people's democracy. The members of the government naturally had to be arrested. Among them, the most dangerous one, as Ron Kovic formulated it, should in the last instance be, if necessary, liquidated, unquote. This meeting and the conversation between the two ministers, however, had taken place 1.5 years before Rajk's arrest and before Yugoslavia was expelled from the Comintern. The conflict between the two countries became dangerously tense in the meantime. There were armed incidents at the border, so Ron Kovic, following the logic of the plot, had to be painted in even more sinister way. He had to give new and more radical orders to Rajk. For the sake of the emplotment, there was need for another meeting in the story. They had to meet one more time. At the trial, Rajk said, I quote him, "If I remember well, it was in August 1948 when Ron Kovic sent a message that in light of the new situation, he wanted to meet me in order to discuss my new tasks. I sent back a message informing him that I was ready to meet, but only if he came to Hungary, and our meeting should remain secret. Among other things, Ron Kovic told me that the people's democracy should be violently overthrown by the help of an armed uprising." And now the case study, making up the case. On the 11th of January 1948, before the communist takeover, still at the time of the coalition government in Hungary, the prime minister, a member of the smallholders party that would be liquidated the next year, invited some friends and foreign diplomats for a day of hunting to Paks, about 100 kilometers south of Budapest. Lajos Dinnyés, the prime minister, had asked a long-retired former smallholder member of the interwar parliament to organize the hunting on the nearby land of the local hunting company. The Yugoslav and Soviet ambassadors, together with other diplomats, were also invited. At the end of the day, the host, Dr. Antal Klein, the former member of the parliament, gave a modest dinner for the guests and invited a few neighbors from the town, among them the daughter of the former local notary, who spoke both German and French, to help entertaining the guests. In return, a month later, the Polish ambassador, who had also been present at the hunting, invited the former notary and his family to a cultural event to Budapest, where Mrazovic, the Yugoslav ambassador, was among the guests too. Mrazovic took notice of the young German-French teacher, as after the cultural event he invited György Tarisnyas, that was the name of the young woman, and her parents to his nearby residence. Following this meeting, the Yugoslav ambassador visited the young woman in Paks twice, but after the break with Yugoslavia, he was considered persona non grata and was expelled from Hungary. Several years later, in the course of his interrogation, the former commander of the Hungarian security services confessed, and I quote him, "At the end of June of 1949, around 10:30 in the evening, Mátyás Rákosi, the Secretary General of the Hungarian Workers' Party, urgently called me to his residence. A Russian language report was in front of him on his desk, from which he translated excerpts for me. According to his translation, I do not speak Russian," said the head of the Secret Services. According to his translation, before he was expelled from Hungary, Mrazovic, the Yugoslav ambassador, had attempted to meet László Rajk. Rákosi told me, "You should rather look after this, as the meeting had certainly taken place. But it seems to me that you at the secret police are unable to find this out," unquote. A few days after this unpleasant meeting at Rákosi's residence, the deputy chief of the secret police came to his boss's office in the headquarters of the AVH, the Hungarian dreaded secret police, and gave him the following report. Quote, "Last night the old one, Rákosi, called as he urgently wanted to talk to you, but we could not find you anywhere. He was extremely dismayed that we have not yet been able to locate where Mrazovic had met Rajk. Wasn't it you," asked Comrade Rákosi, "who had sent over the report that Mrazovic had frequently visited his lover in the countryside? You should rather look around there, as such places are the most appropriate for such clandestine meetings. The old one is convinced that Mrazovic was just a mediator. It had to be the two ministers of Interior who should meet there," he shouted in the telephone, "but you still do not know anything about it." This is how then Ernő Szűcs, the deputy chief of the secret services, started looking for the appropriate place, and he was looking until he ended up in Paks, where Mrazovic's alleged lover, György Tarisnyas, lived. In July, both Antal Klein and György Tarisnyas were arrested and brought to the headquarters of the state security services. Dr. Klein had health rapidly deteriorated in prison. In the course of repeated interrogations, his investigators tried to persuade him to state that the Yugoslav ambassador had asked him to get invited together with two other men for hunting, and it was requested to meet them on the main road at the kilometer stone number 116, from where he would take Mrazovic and the other two men on his horse carriage to his nearby land. The secret police colonel even showed a photograph of the kilometer stone number 116 to Klein. At this point, Klein remarked that there was no entrance from number 116 kilometer sign to his land, so he would not have been able, even if he wanted to, or even if this event had taken place, to bring his guests to his land from that point. Klein did not want to sign the text that had been shown to him, but after long and psychologically torturing interrogations, after he had been promised that following his testimony at the trial, he would immediately be allowed to go home, he signed a document, especially when he was told that Györgyi Tarisnyás had already confessed the meeting, and when confronted with Klein, Reich stated that the reason why he had traveled to Paks was to meet Ron Kovic in the hut on Klein's land. Both Klein and Tarisnyás were testified at the trial. Klein was sentenced to 8 years in prison and was freed in January 1955. Tarisnyás was sentenced for 6 years. Her mother and grandmother spent 3 years in prison without a sentence. Her father spent only 2 years because in the meantime he died in prison. Although after the verdict was announced and László Reich was sentenced to death by hanging, Lieutenant General Peter, head of the HVH, approached László Reich in the small office adjacent to the courtroom, hugged him and said, "You were excellent, my dear Laci," the diminutive of László. Somehow they knew that both of them served the same cause, although in different roles that history and the party have assigned to them. And let me read a small passage from a short story. Through long nights, the two men struggled over the difficult text of the confession. Panting and exhausted, their heads bent over the pages, enveloped in the thick cigarette smoke, each trying to incorporate into it some of his own passions, its own beliefs, his own outlook from a higher perspective. Fedyukin knew just well as Novsky, and let him know it, that all this, the entire text of the confession, formulated on the 10 closely typed pages, was pure fiction, which he alone, Fedyukin, has concocted during the long hours of the night, typing with 2 fingers, awkwardly and slowly, trying to draw logical conclusions from certain assumptions. He was therefore not interested in the so-called facts or characters, but in those assumptions and their logical use, unquote. This is from Danilo Kis's The Tomb for Boris Davidovich. Sorry. Even without the meeting in Paks, that was so costly and complicated to produce, there would have been enough damning material that Reich had accepted and substantiated with his signed confession in order to try and sentence him to death. The seemingly marginal detail, with its insignificant-looking features, nevertheless, helped to bring the political significance, the alleged dangers, closer to the public. It was a close, carefully detailed, easily imaginable incident that one could visualize and remember. Painstakingly producing such realist details at the same time helped the interrogators who scripted the text in collaboration with the tortured defendants to accept, explain to themselves, and identify with the process they set in motion. The protagonists, the interrogators, the accusers, the attorneys, but even the accused considered the trials not so much as a legal case, but the continuation of politics and the construction of a new world with other means. A few years after her boss had been brutally beaten to death in the cellar of the headquarters of the secret services, the young secretary of the deputy head of the Hungarian State Security Police confessed in the course of her interrogation in 1954. Szűcs knew that in the case of quite a few people there was no evidence that would have proven their criminal activities. Nevertheless, as it was beyond dispute that they objectively belonged to the enemy, he directed the interrogators to make this clear in the interrogation reports and ordered to force the accused to accept it. In the course of a concrete case, I had once made reference to a fact whence he said, "Do not let yourself be influenced by the fact," and remarked in a forceful way that compared to the facts we know, it is much more important that these people are obviously our enemies, whatever the facts might say. This is why we should, by any means available, demonstrate this. It might be misguided approaching these cases from a legalistic perspective. If political needs determine the necessity to arrest, if the accused is known to be a criminal at the moment and by way of his or her arrest, then the task of the interrogator is not to assemble the evidence, but to compose the politically and literary, most effective, most useful storyline that sheds light on the essential, the political, the extra-legal truth. Instead of investigating, the task of the interrogator is to produce the facts that guarantee that the plot demonstrates the truth hidden deep under the surface. By having understood the political meaning, the real subterranean significance of the issue, by having understood the political meaning, the real subterranean significance of the issue, it is up to the interrogator to produce the knowledge of the case. We might look at the interrogator of the conceptual trial as if he had subscribed at a perverted version of Vico's verum esse ipsum factum. The true is what is made. Knowledge is not produced via discovery, but rather via invention. As Vico wrote on the most ancient wisdom of the Italians, I quote him, "The rule and criterion of truth is to have made it," unquote. The interrogator is convinced that what is true and what is made or made up, verum et factum, are converging, are interchangeable, are the same. This is the maker's knowledge. Only the one who makes it can have intimate enough knowledge of the things which are human, which are not independent of us, are not natural objects. Should we not simply say, Brecht asked, that we are not able to perceive anything, we are not able to change, even that which does not change us? The Marxist makers of the trials most probably would not have agreed with Vico, who in his New Science claimed that no one can be more certain of history than he who makes it, especially since this sounds, and to a certain extent is in fact, similar to Marx's conviction that man makes his own history. Man's historical obligation is not just to shape what is ahead of time. One cannot change the future without a proper understanding of the past. It is the duty of the historical agent, in awareness of the fuzzy contingencies of the past and full knowledge of the inevitable future, to connect these temporal modalities, to intervene in the past by reinterpreting the facts in order to ascertain that the accidental details of the past conform to the general laws of history and thus contribute to the future outcome in accordance with the recognized laws of history. Excuse me. Imagination, fantasia, the word Vico uses for imaginative reconstruction, is a way to know, to find out things. A close, intimate relationship develops between the inquirer and the imagined object that comes into being as a result of the difficult personal investment that aims to ascertain the authenticity of the imagined objects or events. It is an invention, but exactly since it is not a discovery, it is irrefutable because it is a figment on man's own creative intellect. This is the sort of knowing which participants in activity claim to possess against mere observers. The knowledge of the actors as against that of the audience, of the inside story as opposed to that obtained from some outside vantage point. Knowledge by direct acquaintance, the knowledge that is involved when a work of the imagination or history is described not as correct or incorrect, skillful or inept, a success or a failure, but as profound or shallow, realistic or unrealistic, perceptive or stupid, alive or dead. As Isaiah Berlin summarized Vico's concept of knowledge, of the scienza nuova. What this capacity is, the part it plays in understanding, above all in the recovery of the past, not as a collection of factual beds strung on a chronicle string, but as a possible world, a society which could have had such characteristics, whether it had precisely these or not. There must exist a capacity for conceiving, or at least a claim to be able to convince what it must have been like. This was a quote by Berlin. The initiators of the conceptual trials typically did not read Vico. However, they read Stalin. Who accept hopeless bureaucrats? Who accept archive rats? Can rely on written documents alone, as Stalin rhetorically in 1931 in his infamous letter to the editorial board of the magazine Proletarskaya Revolutsiya on some questions concerning the history of Bolshevism that inaugurated the dawn of socialist realism. Besides novels perceived as works of construction, socialist realism treated fake construction reports as works of art. One might argue that the conceptual interrogator made an obvious categorical mistake, mistaking law for fiction, fact for imagination. What was described could have taken place, but it had not. The conceptualist was not engaged in forensic fact-finding, but in making history in a literal sense, composing the plot as the embodiment of deep essential truths that remained hidden beneath confusing details, or because some things that could have or should have taken place incidentally or accidentally did not, or remained hidden because of the reluctance of the accused to confess. It is a promising move to get rid of the walls of the courtroom and look at the court proceeding as just one of the innumerable fields of communist construction, not much distinct from Stakhanovism. The reported record quantities of steel production, the collectivization of agriculture, Eisenstein's October or Dziga Vertov's Sinai, Stalin's Marxism and the problem of linguistics, the history of the Bolshevik Communist Party, a short course, the construction of the White Sea Baltic Canal, or the work of 120 Soviet writers who, under the editorship of Maxim Gorky, produced a 600-page work, The Stalin White Sea Baltic Canal, in praise of the canal that obviously could never function. All these undertakings were, or considered to be, equal and equally important fields of socialist construction. No distinction existed between reality and its representation. They were not only coextensive, but interchangeable as well. The interrogation or the courtroom were not considered domains separate from a movie theater, a book, a meeting of a party cell, or the pit in the coal mine. Constructed facts were as much part of the domain of coal production or statistics of delinquency as the domain of an indictment in court. No statement made or fact produced under a Stalinist regime was relative to a specifiable separate domain of discourse. I do not offer a philological explanation. I would rather suggest a perspective that might help in making sense of a historical phenomenon that seems to elude comprehension. How could the judges, the prosecutors, the interrogators, those who framed, who ordered, initiated the conceptual trials, explain their actions to themselves? How did they make sense, had they ever tried to do so, of making facts? And how should we historians who are late try to imagine after the fact that what seems to be beyond our grasp? Despite all the apparent contradictions, there are important, however barely visible, sometimes subterranean continuities between the arguments about the notion, the nature, the status of the fact, held by the artistic avant-garde at the time and right after the Bolshevik Revolution on the one hand, and the afterlife of these notions following the complete defeat of the avant-garde by the end of the 1920s on the other. When the practitioners and the theoreticians of the Soviet avant-garde decided to leave the, and I quote them, the paralyzing path of naturalistic trends or the illusionistic representation, the copying of reality, the reproduction of the objects of the real world, the limits of the representational, as Nikolai Tarabukin diagnosed the process of emancipation from the, I quote him, alluring anecdote of the naturalists in his famous From Easel to the Machine text written in 1923, the avant-garde artist left the world of composition behind in order to relocate in the sphere of real constructivism, that is, construction, in building, in so-called production art. It was a move from representation to construction, as the title of the representative anthology stated in 1921. Construction aimed not only and not even primarily at constructing tangible, utilizable objects, but at intervening in the process of reality of the world. The interventionist aim of the new movement was, as Sergei Tretyakov formulated it, not to depict life, but to create it anew in the process. Excuse me. As the constructivist designer Varvara Stepanova defined it, I quote her, composition is the contemplative approach of the artist in his work. Technique and industry, however, have confronted art with the problem of construction as an active process, not as a contemplative reflection. Having demolished the wall that separates construction from reflection, reality from its representation, brute facts from imagination, art paved the way for the Stalinist world of appearances. Artifacts from now on could be presented as facts of life. Literature as a statistical production report. In this way, and not even against their wish, the radical experimental artists and theoreticians were in fact the avant-garde of the Bolshevik leadership, engaged in changing reality, unhindered by the facts of life, by deep and continuous intervention. Scholarly works interpreting and explaining the works and ideas of the Soviet avant-garde usually emphasize the documentary turn, the importance of non-fiction, or the use of reportage as opposed to fiction, the primacy of photorealism, photojournalism, the utopian goal to eliminate the distinction between the artist and the worker, manual and intellectual work, factory and the studio, the contiguity between art and propaganda. The emphasis is typically on the radical gesture of giving up the autonomy of art in order to locate it in the sphere of production, to turn art into a force of production, privileging facticity, factography. The peculiar, radical, contemporary understanding of making and making use of facts, however, usually remain unexplored. Nevertheless, as Devin Foer, in his introduction of a special issue devoted to the problems of factography, formulated, quote, for them, that is for the factographers, the fact was the outcome of the process of production. Advocating a conception of the fact as action, a process, an operation, the claim was not to veridically reflect reality, but to actively transform reality through factography as opposed to passive documentary that strives to create the most objective depiction of reality possible. The objectivism of an indifferent documentary had no place in the interventionist practices of the factographers, unquote. As one of the leading theoreticians of the avant-garde claimed, and I quote, the motive of realistic strivings was not the copying of reality, as it had been for naturalists, but on the contrary, actuality in whatever respect ceased to be the stimulus for creative work. In the forms of his art, the artist creates its actuality, an object which does not reproduce the objects of the real world, but which is constructed by the artist from beginning to end, outside any projected lines extending towards it from reality, unquote. The ambition of the revolutionary artist fascinated by facts was not to collect, study, and then demonstratively show up the facts found in everyday life, but to produce the facts worthy of attention through and in the course of being engaged in forming and changing the world. The fact thus was not discovered, but made. Reflection on the world that resulted in artistic artifacts, text, images, assemblages, films, produced not only objects, but these objects in turn supposedly became unavoidable facts of life with the potential of changing the subsequent course of events. As Nikolai Chuseok wrote in 1929, we are against the literature of fiction that is called bell letters. We are for the primacy of the literature of fact. For too long, writers have transfigured the world by spiriting the passive, aesthetically stupefied reader away into a world of representations. When, if not now, could we reconstruct this world through the concrete changes required by the proletariat? Whole generations were compelled to play the splendid game of imitating life. Life was built not upon factual, real truths, but upon some kind of pseudo-real verisimilitude that existed only in the imagination. The new literature is a literature that asserts the fact. We are hardly taken in by that organized form of deception known as objectivism, and we are trying to construct a form of class-based generalization without doping anyone. Within the literature of fact, generalization that is montage in the scientific provision of facts for the future that is called dialectical materialism. Literature is only one specific part of the construction of life. The more plotted, that is, the more naturally plotted something is, the more naturally interesting it is. How to uncover this plottedness when it remains hidden from an eye that cannot discern it. This, comrades, will be the art. First, an art of vision, and second, an art of transmission, the art of seeing the plot that is hidden from the unarmed eye will thus be a literature that advances facts. And an art that expounds thus will promote facts. For the sake of brevity, we will simply say the literature of fact, that is, an exposition of the secretly interlocked facts in their internal dialectical arrangement. How can we uncover this internal interdependence of facts, more precisely their purposiveness? How can we do this in a way that does not disperse these facts? How can we make all the literature of facts naturally plotted? The process of overcoming matter is the best hidden heroic plot of our time, unquote. When Andrei Wyszynski, the prosecutor general at the time of the Stalinist purges, stated that, I quote him, concrete crimes committed by this or that individual are only particular cases of one general plan of criminal activity, unquote, and ordered his prosecutors to discard the distinction between criminal statements and criminal acts, then he just repeated Nikolai Chuseok's conviction, and I quote him, "The idea is an object that is just as real as the object that is made with the hands," unquote. As the production artist aimed at abolishing any difference between manual and mental activity, between art and production, it was natural that some production theoreticians arrived at the conviction that material objects and mental images differ only in their corresponding position on a continuum. Quote, "Since conceptual processes are what endow matter with a sensual, perceptual form, it would be absurd not to acknowledge the plan of the object as an object itself. For neither a plan for an object nor an object is in any way an end in itself. The idea, the plan, the workbench, the object, all of these are links in one and the same thingly chain," unquote. Abolishing the distinction between the material and the mental, the tangible and the intangible, treating the mental model as a material object, opened the door to perceiving and treating images, ideas, mental plans, and facts of life in a way similar to how Foucault of the archaeology of knowledge looked at discourses that are not merely groups of signs, but practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. Das Wort ist zur Tat geworden, as Tretyakov claimed. The distinction between imagined and tangible objects, supposedly, became effectively abolished. Imagined objects, facts, events claimed to have the same status as brute facts or solid objects of the world. The avant-garde dreamed of what Stalin managed to accomplish, effectively demolishing the walls that separated the distinct spheres of life. Nothing remained context-specific anymore. The imagined supposed to be as solid as steel. On July the 29th, 1948, in the midst of the ongoing conceptual trial, Gábor Péter, the head of the Hungarian secret police, sent a handwritten note to the Secretary General of the party. I quote, "Comrade Rákosi, I have built it up for myself in this way. I imagine that it happened in this way. It should have happened. It had to come out in this way," unquote. The note was attached to a confession obtained by torture, written by the interrogator following the instruction of the head of the secret police. Erasing the distinction between physical and intellectual activities, what for the critics of Stalinism seemed to be the ultimate sign of voluntarism, for the revolutionary artist was a meaningful and radical contribution to the liberation of the proletariat. In his programmatic 1931 Berlin lecture on der Schriftsteller und das sozialistische Dorf, Sergei Tretyakov drew the conclusion of his more than 2-year-long work in a kolkhoz in the Caucasus. I quote him, "The quest for the correct method of grasping and holding reality is one of the most burning questions in Soviet art. In my opinion, it has three decisive aspects. First, the choice of object, investigating the facts in their specificity and in their concrete manifestation. Second, the journalistic processing of found factual material, enhancing its characteristic moments, extracting the dialectical chain from the process in which the fact is the essential determining link, dressing the fact in an effective agitational form, testing the fact's public social interest and significance. The fact thereby becomes an argument, a signal, a concrete proposal. Third, the practical conclusions. You cannot just observe the object. Instead, by constant work with it, you have to become organically connected with the object. Relations to the material that are based merely upon composition make you responsible for the accuracy of the described events and for their literary form, but not for their future fate. I call participation in the life of the material itself an operative relation. To put it simply, inventing something important is belletristic novelism. Discovering something important is reportage. Constructing something important is operativism." Unquote. Notwithstanding the ideological, administrative, and increasingly legal measures against all radical ideas and expressions in art, important elements of the avant-garde theories and ambitions survived after the end of the 1920s. Centralization that accompanied collectivization, the five-year plan, and forced industrialization demanded continuous, ever deeper intervention. The defeated constructivists, the production artists, the factographers, the artistic workers in the factories of facts, on the cine trains, in the kolkhozes, had been engaged as much, although by different means, and in a naive utopian way, in changing reality, fighting by inventing facts, by deep intervention, as the Stalinist victors had been. The protagonists of the Stalinist purges, not only the accused, but their accusers as well, lived through, took part in, or were influenced by these artistic debates and the highly visible works produced in the atmosphere of the heated discussions. The radical ideas of the artist, in spite of all the appearances the contrary, were not alien to, not even far from, the deeply held convictions of the producers of the purges. To consider the purges as contiguous with the ambitions of the production artists does not amount to a lack of compassion with the victims of the purges and the terror. It is not cynical to state that in their relationship with facts and factuality, there was more than just a family resemblance between the inquisitors and the artists. Most of them ended up as victims of the inquisitors themselves. In 1937, at the time of the purges there, George Lukács published a historical novel in Russian in Moscow. The book appeared in Hungarian only a decade later, in 1947, on the eve of the wave of Hungarian great conceptual trials that started in 1949. The book, probably one of Lukács' most influential works, the other is History and Class Consciousness, was widely read and discussed both in Moscow and in Hungary. The four highest-ranking leaders of the Hungarian Communist Party in 1949 spent long years in Soviet emigration in the interwar years with Lukács. All of them were highly educated. Parallel with the first wave of the Hungarian show trials in 1949-51, a literary show trial, the so-called Lukács debate, was staged both on the pages of the most important ideological journals of the times, in public fora, but also behind closed doors, with the participation of all the most important leaders, including Rákosi, the general secretary of the party. We know from Lukács' correspondence that all that all the most influential communist leaders followed and took an active part in the debate. Lukács and his views were considered so important for the party leadership that, as the correspondence testifies, even at the time of the public trial of Reich, the party leaders found time to deal with Lukács's alleged ideological and aesthetic deviations. In the historical novel, Lukács embarks on a devastating critique of the disintegration of realism following the defeat of the 1848 revolution in Europe. Quote, "The disintegration proceeds in twofold and seemingly contradictory fashion. On the one hand, there is an ever greater disbelief of knowing social reality and hence also history. On the other hand, the presentation of history is of maximum exactness with regard to individual facts torn from their proper context. The subjectively honest writers of the imperialist period consider themselves faithful to history, but this faithfulness is restricted to the observation of individual facts. There develops in the imperialist period a new cult of facts, insisting on the apparent fact is a fallacy, leading to false objectivity." For Lukács, the classical historical novel succeeded in becoming authentic because it reflected on and represented the fundamental trends of historical progress, distilled not from isolated misleading facts, but from deep familiarity and self-identification with popular life. I quote him, "A truthful conception of reality and active participation in events constitute for most writers an insoluble soluble dilemma. How is this dilemma solved? The writer, who is deeply familiar with the tendencies of work in popular life, who experiences them as if they were his own, will feel himself as simply a reproduction of these tendencies themselves, even should he render every individual fact differently from the way he found it. The objectivity of artistic imagination is associated with this partisanship of the active man in the most intimate way. It becomes objective by continuously altering the immediate facts of life, so that the great objective laws, the really decisive tendencies of historical development, may achieve expression." At the time of the Hungarian edition of the historical novel, Merleau-Ponty, still close to Marx, but with a phenomenological understanding of Marxism, published a strange polemical book on a possible interpretation of the Conceptual Trials, in which he wrote, I quote him, "A philosophy of history presupposes that human history is not simply a sum of facts side by side, individual decisions and events, ideas, interests, institutions, but there is in the presence and in the flow of events a totality moving towards a privileged state which gives the whole its meaning. Reliance on individual, unquote, reliance on individual isolated apparent facts torn from their proper context, according to Lukács, leads to dead scientific objectivity, to the bourgeois cult of the facts, to escape the dilemma of ever greater disbelief of knowing social reality on the one hand, and the supposed need to faithfulness that is restricted to the observation of individual facts. It is imperative to be able to see, to be aware of the great objective laws. For those who are fully aware of the really decisive tendencies of historical development, it becomes not only possible, but also necessary, inevitable, to continuously alter the immediate facts of life in order to arrive at objective assessment. As history has already revealed its own reality, it provides the framework in which the facts and particular individual phenomena could be fitted. After he had ordered to beat his brother to death, and before he himself was murdered by his own colleagues, the deputy head of the secret police wrote in one of his confessions, and I quote him, "Whenever the assumption seemed to be plausible and we were able to produce facts supporting it, I gave orders to the interrogators to shape the interrogation reports according to the assumptions. For us, factists, Faktikov, there is no such thing as a fact as such, wrote Tretyakov. There is the fact as effect, and the fact as defect. The fact that strengthens our positions, and the fact that weakens it. In his handwritten notes before he was murdered, on November the 7th, 1950, the deputy head of the secret police acknowledged, "I am responsible for having ordered my officers of taking interrogation minutes in a way that, although in essence they contained reality, but did not reflect the facts. And in this way, these faithful reports misled the party." Thank you.
Thank you very much, István. This is a lot to digest, both because I must confess I did not even know some of the facts of the matter, but the facts are getting so blurred not only with fiction but also with suggestions, in the way that these are documents which in a sense are pure fantasies, and they are based on suggestions being made to those who are basing the confessions on the suggestions, so that outside of the self-referentiality, I don't know what remains against which we can even think of a world out there to which they could be considered representations. So this is really, it's sort of to wrap one's mind around the kinds of documents these are and what kind of a history one can write around them is something I'm still struggling with. But I'm sure there are people here who are much more conversant with these kinds of documents and the uses to which they have been put. And let me turn with that to some of the historians, but not only. We have several experts, not only of the region, but also professional historians here, but some of whom you know and some don't. So I think it would be nice if you just introduce yourself when you ask the questions.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kylie Thomas, and I'm a junior visiting fellow here at the IWM. And I can't claim to be conversant with the facts that you've presented, but I found it a really fascinating talk. And well, kind of. And one of the things that I wanted to ask is something that I've long been fascinated about, and it's why under authoritarian regimes, there's this keeping up appearances, so keeping all of the apparatus of law, of the courts and interrogation, imprisonment, and lengthy extractions of confessions and torture and all of these things, and in order to produce the confession. So in other words, all of it is for nothing, but keeping the apparatus, and in some ways in grander form than under, I don't know, so-called democracy. And then the second thing that I was fascinated by was when you spoke about the use of the photograph in the trial, and how it was presented as evidence, but it was the undoing of the evidentiary, and it was just fascinating in relation to photography. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So what I try to argue for, partly by the help of these very serious constructivists in Soviet Russia in the 1920s, was that despite what we usually think and claim, that appearances primarily had propaganda functions, I suggest to take this issue much more seriously. And what if we accepted the fact that those who made use of appearances, who produced those appearances, did that in order to be able to intervene in reality. That was a kind of intervention. It was not simply propaganda. By having produced production reports, you are strengthening the country. In fact, you are waging a war in a bipolar world, and reports count and might change the course of events. If you think that things are just, or the singly nature of things is a continuum from the mental images to the tangible objects, then it is not so unimaginable to think that the prosecutors could become convinced themselves that the accusations had some real core, that if one can suppose that the accused entertained certain ideas, and it's very difficult to disprove this, then you feel justified to take part in such legal actions. Not only because you think that your thoughts can have material consequences, that there is no real distinction between a thought and an object, but also in turn by taking part in such a procedure, the procedure itself, the embodied appearance, the real trial, the confession, the sentence itself, all are interventions in the affairs of the world that might change the course of events. You are producing the facts by doing this. You are justified to do this because you are really producing something that makes a difference. So if you look at it in this way, then probably it's a different perspective than when we usually think that all these things were created for public consumption, for pedagogical reasons only.
Okay, so my basic question is how specific your parallels are. You see, okay, well, you see, well, first of all, you are creating variations on the most basic master narrative of Western civilization. If you leave this building and look around in Vienna, you will see huge buildings on the top of which you find a cross. That stands as a symbol of an innocent being executed on the basis of false accusations by the legal powers. That's the basic. Socrates and Jesus are great symbols, and innocence as opposed to law, and the truth expressed and delivered by the representative of the Spirit have been already by St. Paul opposed to the representatives of law. How new is this? I don't know. Secondly, when you make a bold parallel between Russian avant-garde and the practice of the show trial. Conceptual trial, that's translated from the Hungarian, this won't do. It's conceptual, or something not conceptual. You know, it's based on the previous conception that is being delivered instead of truth in the trials, but that's a detail. That's not important. So you see the approximation of truth to the workings of the spirit and the autonomy of spirit that also has a Christian past and a Socratic past, and it has been first legislated, if you wish, by Kant. And it is the moment of German Enlightenment, Kant and Goethe, in which conceptual imagination as being of the essence, as opposed to a dogmatic faith in the existence of an outside world without the intervention of the human spirit. Well, this was called critique. And that is, if you wish, the form of modernity. It is not specific to the Soviet Union. And there's a difference there, because you see, the aim of Kant, and in an artistic way, the aim of Goethe and even of Lukács in the historical novel, was to discover a way in which the unprovable and unsustainable simple idea of an external existence can be sustained so that a valid and objective notion of truth can be still preserved. In other words, I don't think that Kant and Goethe and their romantic and avant-garde followers would have said that lies were permitted. And a lie and error, force of subjectivity, and the demise of objectivity as it has been described by various authors are not quite identical. And there's another fact too that is very important in history. The importance of confession in jurisprudence, it's of course a religious notion. Confession is a part of justification, which is of course a religious idea, and it has been indeed introduced, especially by the Inquisition, but of course it appeared even earlier than that. And there are indeed parallels. So, you know, the confession, even under duress, to be a decisive argument to decide the presence or absence of crime, innocence or crime, that's of course is an old religious idea. It has to do with the idea of revelation. And of course the idea that you have addressed very interestingly of the inner truth, as of course it differs from the cold facts that of course in their individuality, far from context, cannot be true. Again, was the religious idea of the confession as a way of finding out the truth of a life, even if even the Inquisition, of course, were forcing confessions through torture, still was this a license for lying? These are genuine questions. I don't know. But to say that Tretyakov, whom I happen to know, I don't know whether you know his Chinese novel, Teng Shi Hua. It's a very excellent and interesting novel. And was he really thinking that he was creating a reality? This is the oldest artistic metaphor of creation of a new world. It's there in Michelangelo. It is again not specific to these political regimes. So I'm doubtful, not about the truth of what you're saying, because I don't doubt that. Where I have doubts is the specificity of this moment in this respect.
Thank you. Let me start with your last remark about Tretyakov, who was incidentally a close friend of Brecht's. Of Brecht, yes, and they were planning a series of plays on trials, and Tretyakov translated Brecht's Der Maßnahme, which was about the moral questions of the revolution. Anyway, what might be specific in the case of these artists at the beginning of the 1920s. And I think that in this sense there is a difference between what they were interested in and what Michelangelo did or tried to do. That they were the protagonists of a movement that they considered to be something new, what they called the art or the literature of the fact. These were the so-called factographers. And we usually think that these were documentary artists, and we treat Dziga Vertov as just a documentary artist representing the world in front of their eyes or their camera. But what they really wanted to do is to look seriously at the problem of facts. And this is what I try to emphasize. They were very serious constructivists in this sense, and I tried to understand their relationship, their understanding to the facts and how they understood them, and what they tried to do with it, and how they tried to use their specific notion of the facts of life in their artistic, social, and political interventions. And I think that obviously there were precedents, and there was a history behind them, which might lead quite far back, but to a certain extent, this very serious dogmatic type of constructivism was something new at the beginning of the new Soviet state. I did not simply try to draw parallels between these trials and the work of the avant-garde. My primary question was really, how do the people who framed these trials could explain to themselves what they were doing? And in the course of looking for an answer, I proceeded backward. First, I thought that I should go back to Lukács, especially because I was first interested in the Hungarian case. This was a very pedestrian way of thinking, what I followed, and I realized the parallel of the Hungarian publication of the historical novel and the beginning of the trials, the Lukács debate, and the political trials, and then I went back to the debates between Lukács and Brecht, the reality debate, the expressionist debate, then I realized that I had to go back to the factographers and to understand what they meant on facts and how they tried to use it. And what I want to claim here is that I agree with you that there is a real difference between what I try to describe here and lies, or constructing facts and simply lying. But I think that it's possible to prove that the people who designed these trials, who took part in them, did not think that what they did was simply lying. But it is possible to arrive at the conclusion, this is what I think, if you follow this history, to ascertain that they had the means to explain these things to themselves. That they really thought that by what they were doing, they are changing the world, and in doing so, they were justified to do what they were doing. They were not simply cynical murderers or torturers. What they did was something different and probably something interesting for us. I think that, yes, it's possible to go back to the beginning of the history of the West and to see how these imagined or framed events became material force, and you go out the street and you can see that. But I am dealing with a specific historical period, and I try to draw the borderlines historically and try to understand how these different fields of life, like art and the show trials, might explain in certain ways one another, although it, for the first sight, looks strange and implausible. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Moish Postone from Chicago. I would actually like to move a little in the other direction and talk about the historical specificity of the 60 years after the October Revolution. And shift the focus when you're talking about reality to talk about an object that I don't think I heard emphasized in your talk, which is history. History as a process, particularly if you read Lukács, and the problem with facts are that they hover on the surface, and the underlying process can be completely obscured by staying on the surface. And I'd like to tie that together. The reason I mention this, let's say, 50-year period, is that retrospectively, I think one can regard this period as being the period when it became a dominant mode of thinking that humans were creating history actively. That history wasn't simply an object out there, but is something which is the result of human action. So that the question then becomes the correct action for that process, and the elimination of those who stand in the way of that process. I don't think this is the case only of the show trials. I think it was also the case in the United States, the period from about 1947 to about 1955, the period that's generally regarded as McCarthyism, wasn't as terror-driven as the Stalinist trials. People weren't shot, but nevertheless, people lost their jobs, and it was always on the basis of what retroactively appeared to be innuendo, lies, but I don't think so. I think these were seen as attempts to grasp what were regarded as a deeper truth, and a deeper truth that, particularly after 45, you have a struggle for history. There are only two players left in the world after 1945. You have a struggle for history, and anything that gets in the way of the success of that struggle must be due to a conspiracy. And what you have in common between the show trials and the McCarthyite hearings is the idea of an invisible conspiracy which has different names. In the West, it's called communism. Stalin has other names for it, whether he starts with Tito or Trotsky, or increasingly in the 50s, Zionism. But it is a plot which is preventing history from being realized. And I think that this issue of fact and reality, I think should be, or I would frame it, in terms of the reality really at stake is history. And during that period of time, there was the assumption that humans make history politically through struggle. I think that's one that sort of has faded since the early 70s. And it's that dimension that I think renders what seems retrospectively to be madness of the period, at least maybe a little understandable.
Thank you very much. Going back to Lukács, I should confess that my reading of the historical novel is not easy to justify. But I wanted to highlight those elements in the book, which could be connected with the ideas of the avant-garde of the 1920s, mostly against whom, or partly against whom, Lukács wrote his book. Lukács, however, devoted a lot of text to these debates with the factographers, starting in the late 1920s, early 1930s in Berlin, and then when he went to Moscow, he continued that debate, emphasizing, and this is the relevance to your observation, that reality is not what one grasps on the surface, especially not in the case of history. Reality is the deep essence of things, which cannot be grasped by the help of simply observing, recording the facts on the surface. There's not only a historical plan that is unfolding in part by the help and in part against the actions of humans in the world, but something that one cannot, without which one cannot understand the reality in which one exists. So in a certain sense, there was obviously the image of something transcendental in their thinking. Now, I don't think that you can draw a direct parallel between what happened in the Soviet Union, both in between the two world wars and right after the Second World War, and what happened in the United States with the outbreak of the Cold War following the Second World War. Even if you can simply describe certain ideas as conspiracy theories, the nature of them were very different. The Committee of Anti-American Activities did not want to create a history by the help of interrogating, among others, Bertolt Brecht. Whereas my claim is, and I think that here there is a real difference between what I try to say and what would such a parallel imply, that whereas in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, these proceedings were meant to really change the course of history, the course of events. In the US, they wanted to eliminate communism or communists. There was a real hysteria, real fear. This was part of the ongoing war for political hegemony. In my view, it is interesting and worth to study in comparison with the other, but I would not say myself that these were the same on the two parts of the Atlantic.
I didn't mean they're the same, but they're similarly situated.
Hi there, I'm Aspen Brinton. I'm a visiting fellow here. A follow-up observation related to Moishe's question, and not so much a question at the end, but as you were talking, I kept trying to sort of hedge my bet whether you were going to accuse both the artists and the interrogators of wanting to be like gods, which I think was sort of the first question, right? That they were, artists and gods are both in the business of creation and construction, which the interrogators are in. And then at certain moments I also thought that then you were about to accuse both the interrogators and the constructivist artists of being historians, which is to follow up on Moishe's point, in that they, in constructing a forced confession and in trying to construct the course of events, they are doing very much what a historian actually does in the archive, in looking at pieces of information and trying to construct a narrative to leave behind to construct a world. I mean, history books can themselves construct whole worlds, and you can write 10 history books about the same set of facts. So it was just an observation of sort of the flow of the argument.
Yes, thank you. From a certain perspective, yes, this is what I wanted to say. I mentioned at one point that it was obvious that their conviction was that you cannot intervene in the future without having a proper past for that future, which means that you have to intervene in the past as well. And this is the way how these accusations, the plots of the accusations were created retrospectively. There was always a need to insert certain elements before that part of the story which they were just writing. In order to make it credible or usable, to be able to create it in the right way, there was always need to insert more and more things before, to write it backward. And by writing it backward, they had to change the past. In the case of all these defendants of these trials, the story usually starts quite some time before the present, at the moment when these people became members of the mostly illegal movement. And in the darkness of illegality, facts are always very questionable. Nobody exactly knows who is related to whom in what ways, what happens in the solitude of the interrogation room when you are arrested by the services of the Ancien Regime. And this is the way how, according to the story, one has usually been recruited as an agent or as a spy. And by writing these retrospective life stories backward, you have to write the context or rewrite the context backward as well, inserting new elements, creating a new past from which the imagined future would somehow follow almost organically. Yes, in that sense, one can say that they were creators and they were historians as well, and it was just such a fantastic feeling of power to be able to change not only the future but even the past as well.
May I ask a straightforward question? What is the just one sentence? What is the main difference between your theory and Dostoevsky's theory of the Grand Inquisitor?
How do you mean that?
Literally.
That doesn't help.
You remember,
yes.
Of course, and as we all do. Well, you know, the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's story explains, and that's of course a demonic story that, according to Dostoevsky, is in a twilightly ambiguous way at the bottom of the religious story too. Okay? Namely that evil is a way to the good. And this, and of course, and violence can be exerted. But this is also, of course, the idea of Hegel, and also the idea of Goethe, the Faust, and so on. So that kind of historical demonic story,
yes.
that, yeah. And okay, and that demonic story, that of course, in which Dostoevsky describes his main enemy, the Enlightenment.
Yes. Now
you see.
This is what I've already tried to say, that as far as I can see, not only from what I have mentioned here, but as you know, there were several so-called supervisory trials when the perpetrators were tried and interrogated in several rounds after Stalin's death.
They insisted they were criminals.
And if you read carefully these interrogation reports and even the memoirs of some of these people, which is not very easy to read, but this is why we are historians, to try to make sense of such text. you can see that these people did not consider themselves as the hands of evil in order to achieve something good. They did not consider themselves martyrs to sacrifice themselves for the common good. What I wanted to say was that there was a way for them to get out of this conundrum, to explain this to themselves in a way that even their wives would have been able to understand. In a way, this is what they thought, and this is what we know. There is a new book by Yuri Shkleskin, The House of the Government, about one building where there were over 500 apartments, where all the high members of the high echelons of the Soviet Party lived. And you read these diaries and letters written to each other, and they are really shocking and moving and really tragic. And they explain to their wives and children and lover what they did and how they did it when they themselves have already been arrested and are in the Lubyanka or on the Gulag. And this is more or less what they are doing, that saying that this was a way to try to advance the cause of progress, to change the world. Yes, so this is what I wanted to say.
I think, István, if you permit us, we close the discussion here and we continue later. So thank you very much for an extremely thought-provoking and rich talk. As you can see, it's produced quite some discussion and dissent, but I think it's an extremely provocative thesis which you've put forward, and since this is the first time you've presented it in public, I hope we'll hear more of the book as it develops, and we hope to have you back. Thank you very, very much.